In March 2011, a town of 23,000 people in northern Mexico was erased in 3 days. Not because its residents had done anything wrong, because two men who had spoken to American federal agents shared surnames with people who lived there. That is what it cost to know something in cartel territory. This video covers 10 documented cases, verified through federal court records, independent human rights investigations, and reporting from some of the most credible outlets in the world, in which ordinary civilians paid the highest possible price simply for being in proximity to information that criminal organizations needed to contain. Students on a bus, children at a birthday party, patients in a clinic trying to get clean, a journalist with a notepad, a mother driving to a wedding. None of them were operatives. None of them were threats. They were people who saw something, or were connected to someone who did, or were simply in the wrong place at the moment an organization decided that silence was worth any cost. Section 1. The town that disappeared. In March 2011, a small ranching town in northern Mexico called Allende was wiped off the map. Not in a war, not in a natural disaster, in 3 days. Allende sits in the state of Coahuila, about 40 minutes south of Eagle Pass, Texas. It had around 23,000 residents, farmers, families, people who had lived there their whole lives. Most of them had no connection to any criminal organization. Many of them shared a handful of common surnames: Garza, Moreno, Villanueva, Gaitan. That is what got them taken. The Los Zetas criminal organization was, at the time, the most aggressive and feared outfit operating in Mexico. They had started as a group of former military special forces soldiers who defected and began working for the Gulf Cartel, before eventually breaking away to run their own operation. By 2011, they controlled large sections of northern Mexico through a combination of bribery and the kind of violence that left entire towns too frightened to speak. In Coahuila, they owned the police. Not figuratively. Witnesses who later testified in American federal courts confirmed that officers at local, state, and even some federal levels were on the Zetas payroll. Plaza bosses signed off on who lived and who did not. Emergency services were instructed to stand down. The entire infrastructure of safety and accountability had been hollowed out from the inside. Running Zetas operations in and around Allende and the border city of Piedras Negras was a man named Alfonso Cuellar, known as Poncho. He reported directly to the Trevino brothers, Miguel, known as Z40, and Omar, known as Z42, who led the organization. Cuellar's top lieutenant, a Dallas-born trafficker named Jose Vasquez Jr., was handling communications and moving large quantities of substances across the border into Texas on a regular basis. What neither of them knew was that the DEA had been watching Vasquez for years. After a series of arrests and a bust involving over $800,000 found vacuum-packed inside the gas tank of a pickup, DEA agents in Dallas built a case. Their operation was called Too Legit to Quit. Their goal was to get close enough to track the Trevino brothers directly. When they finally got leverage on Vasquez, they persuaded him to hand over something extremely valuable: the personal cell phone identification numbers of Miguel and Omar Trevino themselves. Numbers that could be used to track their locations in real time. That information was then passed to a DEA supervisor in Mexico, who shared it with a Mexican federal police unit. That unit had a known history of working alongside criminal organizations. The Treviños found out within days. They traced the leak back to Allende, back to the surnames connected to Vasquez and to those around Cuellar. And on the night of March 18, 2011, Zetas gunmen moved into the town and began going house to house. They did not come looking for the men who had talked. Those men had already fled to the United States. The people who remained were their relatives, their neighbors, the people who worked for them, the people who happened to share a last name, and people who simply had the wrong door. Over 3 days, the armed groups tore through Allende and the surrounding municipalities. Heavy machinery was used to flatten homes. At least 40 properties and 7 ranches were destroyed. Victims were taken from their houses, from the street, from wherever they were standing when the trucks arrived. Some had no idea what was happening. Some understood immediately and ran. The 089 emergency line for the region received 1,451 calls for help across those 3 days. Not one was answered. Municipal police were present at some locations and did not intervene. Witnesses later testified that officers were actively participating in the disappearances. The bodies of those taken were not buried. They were placed into large industrial containers and dissolved using a mixture of diesel and caustic soda. What remained was ash, small fragments of bone, and pieces of teeth. By the time Mexican authorities eventually moved into the area years later to investigate, there was almost nothing left to find. The final confirmed figure from Mexico's National Human Rights Commission is around 300 people taken. The number of those confirmed to have lost their lives, as opposed to simply vanishing, is still unclear. For 3 years after March 2011, Allende was silent. Residents did not report what they had seen. They did not file complaints. Some who tried were contacted shortly after and told clearly what would happen to their remaining family members if they continued. One woman who spoke to investigators described receiving a call the same day she gave her statement. She withdrew the complaint and did not speak again for years. It was not until 2014 that the Mexican government publicly acknowledged the events. In 2019, the Interior Secretary stood in the main square of Allende in front of the municipal palace and formally apologized on behalf of the state. The 2 men whose cooperation with the DEA set everything in motion, Vasquez and Garza Gaitan, were living under protection in the United States at the time of that ceremony. One of them was posting on social media. The DEA agent who ran Operation Too Legit to Quit was named Agent of the Year in 2011. None of the 300 families received anything close to justice. As of 2021, a U.S. federal sentencing hearing for a Zetas member connected to the attack produced court testimony confirming the mechanics of the event in detail. It is the closest thing to an official account that exists. Allende is the most extreme version of a pattern that appears over and over in the history of organized crime in Mexico. The idea that information itself becomes a death sentence, not just for the person who holds it, but for everyone within reach of them. The next case involves people who held no information at all. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and that was more than enough. Section 2. The 72 migrants. On August 24, 2010, a group of Mexican Marines pushed open the door of a remote ranch in the municipality of San Fernando in the northern state of Tamaulipas, roughly 100 miles from the U.S. border. What they found inside stopped them cold. 72 people. All of them shot, most of them handcuffed, most of them blindfolded, stacked in a room on the property of a ranch called El Huizachal. They were migrants from Central and South America, 58 men and 14 women, who had been making their way north toward the United States when Los Zetas stopped their bus, forced them off the road, and took them to that ranch. Within 24 hours, every single one of them was gone. One person survived. He was 18 years old, from Ecuador, and he would later be referred to only as Luis. He had been shot and left for gone, but he managed to get himself out of the property and reach a military checkpoint. His testimony was the first account the Mexican government had of what happened inside that building. What he described was a forced choice. The Zetas had a practice at the time of stopping buses in Tamaulipas and pulling off the male passengers. They wanted bodies. They were in an active territorial conflict with the Gulf Cartel, fighting for control of the smuggling corridors into the United States, and they needed recruits. People to move substances, run lookout posts, carry weapons. Migrants heading north were an easy source. They had no documents, no local connections, and no one in Mexico who would report them missing. The standard offer was simple: join or face the consequences. Those who agreed were pressed into service. Those who refused or who could not pay a fee to be released were taken somewhere quiet. At El Huizachal, 72 people refused. This was not, according to the investigators who later examined the evidence, a decision made by panicked or impulsive gunmen. The Marines who arrived at the ranch the following day described a scene that indicated a deliberate, organized process. The victims had been restrained and secured before they were shot. The location had been selected because it was isolated and accessible only by unmarked dirt roads that ran deep into the Tamaulipas countryside. When the Marines made the discovery on August 24th, they were immediately met with armed resistance. A confrontation broke out between the Marines and a group of Zetas operatives who were still in the area. One Marine lost his life. 3 Zetas members were eliminated in the exchange. The others fled. Recovered at the scene were 21 rifles, 101 ammunition clips, 4 bulletproof vests, camouflage uniforms, and 4 vehicles, including a truck built to look like a Mexican naval infantry vehicle. The case was investigated initially by a Tamaulipas official named Roberto Jaime Suarez. He was described by Mexican President Felipe Calderón as the top investigator on the massacre. On August 25, 2010, 2 days after the discovery of the bodies, Suarez disappeared. He has not been seen since. A second officer who was working the case also vanished at the same time. In the weeks that followed, the Mexican authorities identified 31 of the 72 people. The rest remained without names. Most had been traveling without documents. Some had given false identities along the route. Many had families waiting for them somewhere who had no idea what had happened. A group of journalists, writers, and activists later built an online memorial called 72migrants.com, attempting to reconstruct the individual lives of each person taken. It took years of work. Many of the profiles were never completed. The man eventually identified as the commander of the operation was a Zetas lieutenant named Edgar Huerta Montiel, known as El Huache. He was a former member of the Mexican Army before joining the organization. He was arrested in June 2011 in the state of Zacatecas by federal police. During interrogation, he stated that more than 600 bodies were buried in hidden graves across the San Fernando area. The Mexican government never officially confirmed that figure, though subsequent discoveries in the same region would come close to validating it. Local police, it later emerged, were not uninvolved. A classified memo from Mexico's Attorney General's office, partially declassified in 2014, confirmed that officers from San Fernando's municipal force had been serving as lookouts for the Zetas and had been actively involved in intercepting migrants off the buses. 18 local officers were under investigation when the memo was produced. The police chief of San Fernando was arrested in April 2011, along with 16 of his 25 officers. For the 72 people who lost their lives at that ranch, the reason they were taken comes down to something very specific. They had been pulled off a bus and forced into direct contact with the internal workings of an organization that could not afford to have anyone leave who had seen its face. Whether they joined or refused, they had seen the people involved, heard the instructions, and understood the system. That made them a problem, regardless of what they chose. The Zetas did not distinguish between people who might talk and people who would not. Anyone who had been inside that situation was a potential liability. The solution was the same in every case. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened at El Huizachal in 2010 was, by every measure, one of the most visible and documented examples of what cartel organizations did to people who ended up knowing too much through no fault of their own. But as shocking as 72 was as a number, it turned out that San Fernando was not done producing those numbers. Less than a year later, investigators would return to the same municipality and begin pulling bodies out of the ground by the dozen. The scale of what they found there would take months to process, and it pointed to a system of elimination that had been running far longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Section 3. The Highway of Graves. By April 2011, investigators already knew that San Fernando, Tamaulipas was one of the most dangerous stretches of ground in Mexico. The events of August 2010 had made that clear. But what began unfolding in the spring of 2011 suggested that what happened at El Huizachal was not an isolated incident. It was one visible point in a much larger, much longer operation that had been running quietly alongside Federal Highway 101 for an extended period of time. Federal Highway 101 is the main road connecting the cities of Tamaulipas with the border crossings into Texas. Trucks, buses, and private vehicles use it constantly. It is the kind of road that looks ordinary from the outside. Long stretches of flat terrain, small towns spaced far apart. Little in the way of visible authority once you move past the checkpoints. For a period during 2010 and 2011, that road was a trap. Los Zetas had established a system along Highway 101 in which armed groups would stop passenger buses at points that looked, from a distance, like official military or police checkpoints. They wore uniforms. They had vehicles. They waved buses to the side of the road with the same gestures that legitimate forces used. Passengers had no immediate reason to understand that something was wrong until the men came aboard. What happened next followed a consistent pattern, according to testimony gathered by Mexican investigators. Women were separated from men. The men were taken off the bus and given a choice. The same forced recruitment offer that had been operating in the region for years. Join the organization or face the consequences. Those who agreed were taken away. Those who refused, those who were deemed too old or too young to be useful, and those who had simply seen too much of what was happening, were loaded into vehicles and driven off the highway onto the network of unmarked dirt roads that ran through the Tamaulipas countryside. The women, in most documented cases, did not survive either. Families in Reynosa and Matamoros began noticing something in early 2011. Buses were arriving at their destinations with no passengers. Luggage was sitting uncollected at terminals. People who had boarded coaches heading north were simply not arriving. Bus company employees told reporters privately that they had been stopping at police checkpoints for months, reporting that passengers were being forcibly removed from their vehicles and that nothing was being done about it. The San Fernando Municipal Police Chief, it later emerged, was one of the reasons nothing was done. He was arrested on April 21, 2011, along with 16 of his 25 officers. They had been operating as an extension of Los Zetas within the municipality, identifying targets, directing traffic toward cartel checkpoints, and providing protection that allowed the operation to continue without interference. The scale of what had been happening only became clear once investigators began digging. The first bodies were found on April 1, 2011. Then more. then more sites. By April 10th, the count had reached 88 people across multiple separate grave locations. By April 12th, the Mexican military confirmed the discovery of 28 additional bodies, pushing the total to 116 across 15 identified sites. The digging continued for weeks. When it finally stopped, investigators had recovered at least 193 bodies from 47 separate locations spread across the municipality of San Fernando. Most were identified as Mexican nationals, unlike the predominantly Central American victims from the year before. Many were ordinary travelers, people who had boarded buses in other states and were heading north for work, to visit family, or to attempt the crossing into the United States. The man arrested as the operational commander responsible for the largest portion of the takings was Martín Omar Estrada Luna, known as El Kilo. He was a Zetas lieutenant and, according to the DEA, one of the most operationally aggressive figures in the entire organization at that time. He was captured in the Tamaulipas capital of Ciudad Victoria on April 17, 2011. Mexican authorities confirmed he was personally linked to at least 217 individual acts of lethal violence in San Fernando alone. He was also connected to the events of August 2010. The same Zetas commander who had overseen the taking of the 72 migrants had been operating the same system on the same road for months afterward. What the San Fernando graves revealed was not a series of separate incidents, but a single, continuous industrial process. People were being intercepted on a public highway in large numbers, transported to pre-selected sites, and disposed of in ways designed to prevent discovery. The locations of the graves were spread across enough distance that no single local resident would have had visibility into the full picture. The police who might have documented complaints were part of the operation. The emergency infrastructure of the municipality had been rendered useless. A classified internal memo from Mexico's Attorney General's office, partially released in 2014, stated directly that local San Fernando officers had been helping the Zetas intercept people traveling through the area. It described the officers as performing the function of lookouts. 18 officers were listed as being under active investigation at the time the memo was produced. More than 10,000 residents left San Fernando in the aftermath of the discoveries. The local mayor at the time estimated that roughly 10% of the town's population relocated, many without saying where they were going. The priest of San Fernando, who continued driving his regular route between parishes throughout the period, told reporters that armed men in masks had stopped him repeatedly. Each time, he identified himself and was allowed to continue. He noted that this was happening to everyone who moved through the area. It had simply become normal. Most of what unfolded in San Fernando happened to adults traveling alone. The next case involves something that is harder to process: a private gathering of teenagers with no connections to any criminal organization in a residential neighborhood on a Saturday night. What happened to them and the reason it happened reveals just how far the logic of eliminating potential witnesses had spread by 2010. Section 4. The Birthday Party. Jesus Enriquez had just turned 18. On the evening of January 30th, 2010, his family and friends gathered at a private home on Villa de Portal Street in the Villas de Salvarcar neighborhood of Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. The neighborhood was a working-class area of low concrete houses and narrow streets in the southeastern part of the city. The people at that gathering were high school and university students. Most of them were athletes. Several played on their school football team. The youngest was 15. The oldest was 20. None of them had any connection to any criminal organization. Just after midnight, 2 trucks pulled up outside the house. A group of armed men got out and entered the property. They opened fire on everyone inside. Some of the young people ran. Some were found in the yards of neighboring houses. Some were found in the street. By the time it was over, 16 people had lost their lives. Ciudad Juárez in 2010 was the most dangerous city on earth by recorded rate of lethal violence. The Sinaloa Cartel and the Juárez Cartel had been in open conflict for control of the city and its border crossing since 2008. More than 3,000 people would lose their lives in Juárez that year alone. President Felipe Calderón had deployed thousands of troops to the city, and still, the numbers kept rising. In that environment, residents had become used to the sound of violence at night. What made Villas de Salvarcar different was not the scale, it was who the victims were. The mayor of Ciudad Juárez said publicly, within hours of the attack, that the victims appeared to have no ties to organized crime whatsoever. He called them good kids. The governor of Chihuahua attended the funerals. Calderón himself eventually visited and personally handed a memorial plaque to the parents. One woman at the scene, who identified herself only as Martha and refused to give her surname out of fear, told reporters that both her sons had been at the party. Both of them lost their lives that night. They had been on the school football team. What had actually happened only emerged after an arrest 4 days later. A man identified as José Dolores Arroyo Chavarria, 30 years old, was taken into custody by the Mexican military. In testimony before prosecutors, he described the chain of events that led to the attack. A Juárez cartel figure operating under the nickname El Diaz had received information from an internal source, a lookout, that the people gathered at that house in Villas de Salvarcar were members of a street gang called Artistas Asesinos, also known as AA. That gang operated in service of the rival Sinaloa cartel. El Diaz ordered the attack based entirely on that information. The information was wrong. The people at the birthday party were students watching a boxing match at a private home. The lookout who identified them had either made a serious error or had been working from nothing. Nobody at that gathering was connected to the Artistas Asesinos or to the Sinaloa cartel. They simply lived in the neighborhood, knew the same people, and had been in the same place at the same time. Arroyo Chavarria identified El Diaz and another figure known as El Doce as the men who issued the instruction. Both names were operating name identifiers within the Juárez cartel's street-level enforcement structure. The deeper investigation eventually led to José Antonio Acosta Hernández, known as El Diego, who was confirmed as the senior figure who had authorized the attack. Acosta Hernández was also, as later investigations would establish, the same man who ordered the attack on a rehabilitation clinic in Ciudad Juárez several months earlier, a separate event that also took the lives of people with no involvement in the conflict. He was eventually taken into custody and tried. In testimony he gave regarding both incidents, he confirmed that the orders had come from within the Juárez cartel's command structure, specifically from La Línea, the cartel's enforcement wing. In 2012, the American television network Univision confirmed through its reporting that the weapons used in the Villas de Salvarcar attack had originated from Operation Fast and Furious, a United States Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives program that had allowed firearms to be purchased by suspected traffickers in the United States and transported across the border without being intercepted, on the theory that the guns would eventually lead investigators to cartel leadership. The program became one of the most controversial law enforcement operations in American history. The Villas de Salvarcar connection was one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against it. 4 individuals were convicted of the attack in July 2011. Arroyo Chavarria, Aldo Fabio Hernández, Heriberto Martínez, and Juan Alfredo Soto Arias were each sentenced to 240 years by the state of Chihuahua. A fifth man, Israel Arzate Melendez, had also been arrested and initially presented to the public as a suspect. A United Nations human rights representative who visited Arzate Melendez in 2012 stated publicly that the man had been subjected to abuse during detention and that his confession had been obtained by force. That finding was supported by a Mexican human rights organization, and Arzate's case became a secondary controversy attached to the original attack. The federal government responded to Vías de Salvarcar by launching a program called Todos Somos Juárez, We Are All Juárez, which committed approximately $400 million toward rebuilding the social infrastructure of the city. Education, employment, health provision. 16 teenagers at a birthday party lost their lives because a cartel lookout pointed at the wrong house. No system, no secret, no information. Just a name someone said, and armed men who moved on it without checking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened in Juárez did not stay in one neighborhood or one type of location. The same logic, eliminate anyone who might be a problem, verify the details later, was being applied across the city in every setting imaginable, including the one place people go specifically to try to step away from all of it. The next case involves a treatment clinic, a room full of people trying to get clean, and a decision made by the same command structure that ordered Vías de Salvarcar. Section 5. The Clinic. Ciudad Juárez had around 100,000 people struggling with substance dependency in 2009. That number was not a coincidence. The city had been the primary ground-level distribution hub for substances moving across the border into the United States for years. What gets moved through a place leaves a residue. By the time the Sinaloa and Juárez cartels were at the peak of their territorial conflict, a significant portion of the city's population had been pulled into the orbit of what the organizations were selling, either as consumers, low-level street workers, or both. To serve that population, roughly 62 rehabilitation clinics were operating in Ciudad Juárez by 2009. Some were licensed and monitored by state health authorities. Many were not. The unlicensed ones operated out of ordinary buildings in residential neighborhoods, run largely by former patients who had no formal medical training. They were low-cost, accessible, and largely invisible to official oversight. That invisibility made them targets. The El Aliviane Clinic sat in the Bella Vista neighborhood of the city. On the evening of September 2, 2009, at approximately 7:15 p.m., 12 armed men forced open the main entrance. They moved through the building and gathered the patients, 19 young men, most of them in their teens and early 20s, into a central courtyard. They lined them against the wall. Then they opened fire with AK-47 rifles. The attack lasted, according to neighbors who described hearing it from their homes, approximately 15 minutes. When it stopped, 17 patients were gone. One more passed away in hospital the following day from the injuries he had received. One survived. The clinic's dog was also shot. Blood-soaked footprints in multiple sizes covered the floor from the entrance to the sleeping quarters. A thicker trail marked the path of one man who had managed to crawl toward the door before he ran out of time. 18 people lost their lives at El Aliviane that evening. The immediate question was why? On the surface, a rehabilitation clinic did not seem like a logical target for an organized criminal attack. But investigators and local officials who spoke to reporters in the days that followed described a logic that was specific to the environment of Juárez in 2009. Unlicensed rehabilitation centers, according to testimony gathered by prosecutors, were being used in several ways that made them strategically significant to the cartels. Active gang members from various street-level organizations moved in and out of these facilities when their dependency became unmanageable. Once inside, they were away from their usual contacts and operating structures. Cartels viewed anyone inside those walls as a potential source of information about rival organizations, about personnel, about routes and operations, and also as a potential liability if they spoke to authorities, which some inevitably did. The organizations also, according to court records, used the clinics as recruitment spaces. Young men in recovery were seen as candidates for ground-level positions. Those who cooperated were pressed into service. Those who did not were considered problems. At El Aliviane specifically, the reporting in the immediate aftermath stated that a number of the patients had connections to the Barrio Azteca gang, a street-level organization aligned with the Juarez cartel. The attack, investigators believed at the time, had come from the opposing side of the conflict, from gunmen connected to the Sinaloa cartel's enforcement arm operating in the city. The full picture only became clear years later, when José Antonio Acosta Hernández was taken into custody. Acosta Hernández, known as El Diego, was the operational commander of La Línea, the Juarez cartel's dedicated enforcement wing. He was the same man who had ordered the attack on the Villas de Salvarcar birthday party 2 months after El Aliviane. In testimony and statements made after his arrest, he confirmed that he had personally directed both operations. His words regarding El Aliviane were direct. He had instructed his people to go and eliminate groups of rivals in 2 rehabilitation centers. Chihuahua State Prosecutor Jorge González Nicolás confirmed to reporters that the El Aliviane attack and the Villas de Salvarcar attack shared the same command origin. Same structure, same decision-maker, same chain of instruction. The El Aliviane attack was not the first of its kind in Juarez. It was the 5th mass shooting at a rehabilitation facility in the city within the space of approximately 1 year. The previous year, 8 people had lost their lives in a similar attack at a separate clinic. Local officials had begun warning publicly that the facilities were becoming consistent targets. The state's public security secretary had told media outlets that cartels were actively recruiting at these centers and taking action against those who refused or who were connected to rival organizations. Nobody closed the clinics down. Nobody provided them with security. The warnings circulated and the pattern continued. After El Aliviane, a second attack at a separate Juarez clinic called Vida occurred 2 weeks later. 10 more people lost their lives in that incident, including a doctor and the clinic manager. The September 2009 NPR journalist who reported from outside El Aliviane the morning after the attack spoke to a young man sitting on the pavement up the street. The man would not give his name. He said that the people inside the clinic had crossed La Línea in some way, and that everyone inside had to pay the price for it. Then he said something that stayed in the piece. Most of the people who speak about what happens here end up in the same situation. So we are talking about it right now, and we should not be. That sentence captures the mechanism at the center of every case in this video. The danger was not only in what you had done, it was in what you had seen. And in Juarez in 2009, being inside a building where any of this happened, regardless of who you were or why you were there, was enough. The cases covered so far have all taken place in Mexico, among Mexican nationals and migrants moving through Mexican territory. The next case crosses a different line entirely. It involves American citizens, including children, with dual nationality on a dirt road in broad daylight. What was done to that family, and the question of whether it was deliberate or a catastrophic mistake, has never been fully resolved. Section 6. The Convoy. La Mora is a small settlement in the state of Sonora, Mexico, roughly 70 miles south of Douglas, Arizona. It was founded decades ago by members of an independent religious community, a breakaway group with roots in the broader Mormon tradition, whose ancestors had moved to northern Mexico in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By 2019, the settlement had a permanent population of around 150 people, spread across approximately 30 to 40 homes on about 1,000 acres of high desert terrain. Many of the residents held dual citizenship, American and Mexican, having been born into families that had lived in that specific stretch of Sonora for generations. They were farmers, they were a tight community, and they had been living alongside the escalating territorial conflict between criminal organizations in the region for years. On the morning of November 4, 2019, 3 SUVs left La Mora in a convoy. The vehicles, 2 white Chevrolet Suburbans and 1 Chevrolet Tahoe, were carrying women and children. The adults were traveling to a wedding in a neighboring community. Some of the children were being taken to visit family in the United States. The group had chosen to travel together specifically for safety reasons. They knew the roads in that region were dangerous. Traveling in a group, in daylight, in a convoy, was meant to reduce the risk. It did not. Approximately 70 miles into their journey, in the mountainous terrain along the Sonora-Chihuahua border, the convoy was attacked. What followed unfolded across several separate locations spread over miles of dirt road. The Tahoe was found first. It had been hit by such sustained and concentrated gunfire that the vehicle caught fire. Inside were Ronita Maria Miller, 30 years old, and 4 of her children: Howard Jacob Miller Jr., 12, Crystal Belaine Miller, 10, Titus Alvin Miller, 8 months old, and his twin sister, Tiana Grisel Miller, also 8 months old. All 5 had been shot before the fire took hold. Investigators recovered approximately 200 spent casings from assault-style firearms at the various crime scenes. About 11 miles further along the road, a second vehicle was found. Inside were Donna Ray Langford, 43, and 2 of her sons, Trevor Harvey Langford, 11, and Rogan J. Langford, 2. All 3 had been shot. A third vehicle was found further on. The body of Christina Marie Langford Johnson, 29, was discovered approximately 15 meters away from the vehicle in the dirt. She had been shot dead at close range. 9 people lost their lives, 3 women and 6 children. 13 children survived the attack. Several had been injured. One child, 13-year-old Devin Langford, walked for hours through the mountains after the attack to get help, and then returned to hide his younger siblings in the bushes to protect them before leading rescuers back. Another child survived inside the burning Tahoe. The Mexican government's initial statement attributed the attack to a case of mistaken identity, the suggestion being that the large, dark-colored SUVs had been confused for vehicles belonging to a rival criminal organization that had been operating in the same area earlier that day. A confrontation between 2 opposing groups had taken place in the same region in the hours before the convoy set out. Family members disputed this explanation from the beginning. Julian LeBaron, a cousin of the victims, stated publicly that one of the women had attempted to identify herself to the attackers during the assault, and that the attack had continued regardless. He said it was common knowledge in the area that local authorities and criminal organizations operated in close coordination. He questioned how a vehicle full of women and children, clearly visible in daylight, on a route that local people knew well, could be confused for an armed rival convoy. The region at that time was contested between factions, specifically the Chihuahua-based La Línea group, which operated as the enforcement arm of the Juarez Cartel, and Los Jaguares, a faction connected to the Sinaloa Cartel. Both organizations were fighting for control of the mountain corridors that ran along the Sonora-Chihuahua border. The director of public safety in the municipality of Llanos, Chihuahua, a man named Fidel Alejandro Villegas, was arrested on December 24, 2019, on charges of providing protection for La Línea and of having a role connected to the events of November 4th. By the end of December 2019, the Mexican federal government had consolidated the cases and identified more than 40 suspects. A suspect named Gustavo Hernandez Cabral was arrested in the United States in 2023, detained pending extradition proceedings. In January 2025, a Mexican federal judge ordered that the investigation be reclassified and examined as an act of organized terrorism. A federal judge in North Dakota, hearing a civil case brought by surviving family members, ordered the Juarez cartel to pay $1.5 billion in damages to the victims. That ruling was symbolic in practical terms. No cartel organization was going to present itself in an American courtroom. But the legal finding represented something, a formal acknowledgement in a U.S. federal proceeding that the organization had been responsible for what happened on that road. The La Mora attack did not occur in isolation. The same extended family had been in direct conflict with criminal organizations in northern Mexico for years before November 2019. A member of the broader family community had, 10 years earlier, stood up publicly against one of the most powerful organizations in Chihuahua, named names, organized people, and refused to be silent. He did not survive it either. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. His story comes next, and it is one of the clearest documented examples in this entire video of what happens to a person who witnesses criminal operations at close range and decides, against every reasonable calculation of self-preservation, to speak anyway. Section 7. The Man Who Spoke Up. In the spring of 2009, a teenager named Eric LeBaron was taken from his home in Colonia LeBaron, a community in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. The people who took him left behind a demand for $1 million. Eric was 16 years old. He was the younger brother of Benjamin LeBaron, known to his community as Benji, a 32-year-old farmer and community leader who held dual American and Mexican citizenship and had spent years trying to build something organized and functional out of the scattered religious settlement his family had called home for generations. The LeBaron community in Chihuahua was not wealthy. $1 million was not a number anyone there could meet. And Benjamin made a decision that, in the context of northern Mexico in 2009, was genuinely extraordinary. He refused to pay. He went further than that. He organized. Benjamin had founded a community advocacy group called SOS Chihuahua, Sociedad Organizada Segura, which translates roughly as Secure Organized Society. The group had been pushing back against the grip of criminal organizations on everyday life in the region, trying to build a framework through which ordinary residents could respond to threats collectively rather than in isolated silence. When Eric was taken, Benjamin used that network. He led public protests. He spoke to media. He put his name and his face on the demand for his brother's release in a state where the Juarez cartel and its affiliated organizations had been operating with near total impunity for years. He made the kidnapping visible at a time when the standard response to such events was to pay quietly, say nothing, and hope. Eric was released. The family did not pay the ransom. The cartel let him go. 2 months later, on July 7, 2009, 10 armed men arrived at Benjamin LeBaron's home in Colonia LeBaron. They came at night. They were armed. Some accounts describe them as dressed in a way that resembled law enforcement, though they held no legal authority. They forced their way into the property. They took Benjamin from his home in front of his wife and children. They beat him in the street outside. When his brother-in-law, Luis Carlos Widmar Stubbs, known as Wiso, 29 years old, heard the noise and came out to help, he was taken as well. Both men were shot and left on the road outside the house. Benjamin LeBaron did not survive. Neither did Luis Carlos Widmar Stubbs. The investigation that followed eventually led to the arrest of a man named José Rodolfo Escajeda. Reuters described Escajeda at the time of his capture as one of the most violent and operationally significant figures in the Juarez cartel's structure in Chihuahua. He was identified as the individual who had ordered the attack on Benjamin. Mexican troops captured him several months after the event. The motive was straightforward and documented. Benjamin Lebaron had seen the operation. He had seen how the kidnapping of his brother had been conducted, who was involved at the street level, and how the demand had been communicated. He had then taken that knowledge and made it public, loudly, repeatedly, and in a way that drew national media attention to a region where criminal organizations depended on silence to function. That was the line. Not the protest specifically, and not the refusal to pay the ransom. The line was the visibility. The decision to be seen, named, and heard as someone who understood what these organizations were doing and was willing to say so in front of cameras. His brother Julian, speaking to reporters after Benjamin's death, described what life in that part of Chihuahua had become. He used the phrase war zone, but specified that it was a war zone with children playing in the yard every day. An environment where extreme danger and ordinary domestic life existed in the same physical space, and where the rules of survival required that you never acknowledge the danger out loud. Benjamin had broken that rule, deliberately and in public. After the event, the Mexican government sent soldiers and state police to provide protection for the Colonia Lebaron community. A small military presence was established. It helped in the short term. It did not change what the region was, or what the organizations operating in it were willing to do. The case drew international attention at the time, but it was one of hundreds of similar events occurring across northern Mexico that year. Journalists, local officials, lawyers, community organizers, anyone who acquired specific knowledge of how these organizations operated and then attempted to act on that knowledge publicly was operating in the same territory of risk. Most of them knew it. Some of them continued anyway. What made Benjamin Lebaron's case land differently in the years that followed was partly the clarity of the sequence. The kidnapping, the refusal, the public campaign, the release, and then 2 months later, the men at the door. There was almost no ambiguity in the timeline. He had spoken, they had come. His name returned to public attention 10 years later when 9 members of the extended family were attacked on a mountain road in Sonora. Julian Lebaron, who had spoken to the press after his brother's death in 2009, was again one of the people making statements, this time about the convoy, about the women and children, about the pattern that had followed this particular family across a decade. What the Lebaron cases, taken together, illustrate is that these organizations do not operate on a fixed horizon. A threat addressed at one point is not necessarily gone. A family that draws attention, that refuses to disappear quietly into the ordinary statistics of regional violence, becomes a recurring point of exposure. The next case involves a different kind of witness entirely, a professional one. A journalist who spent years building a documented record of exactly what criminal organizations were doing in her
state, in partnership with corrupt officials, and what happened to the people they wanted gone.
She kept reporting anyway, right up until the night someone came to her home.
Section 8. The Reporter.
Regina Martinez had been covering Veracruz for Proceso magazine for years before anyone outside the state knew her name. Proceso is one of Mexico's most established national investigative publications. It covers politics, crime, and the intersection between the two, which in Mexico, particularly in the years following 2006, meant covering the relationship between government officials and criminal organizations in granular, documented detail. Martinez was the magazine's correspondent in Veracruz, based in the state capital of Jalapa. She was 48 years old, just under 5 feet tall, and by the accounts of colleagues who worked alongside her, was methodical, careful,
and entirely unwilling to stop working on something simply because it had become dangerous. What she was working on in Veracruz was dangerous by any measure. The state of Veracruz had been under the control of Los Zetas for a significant stretch of the years she was reporting. The organization had moved into the state aggressively, and the governors who oversaw Veracruz during that period, Fidel Herrera Beltrán, who served from 2004 to 2010, and Javier Duarte de Ochoa, who followed him from 2010 to 2016, had, according to the investigations that came later, allowed this to happen with full awareness and active participation. Martinez was building the documented record of what that arrangement looked like on the ground. Her reporting described an environment in which hundreds of people had been taken and killed with official complicity. Young men working as street-level distributors, farmers, politicians who had stepped out of line, and women who had attended private gatherings organized by connected figures and subsequently vanished. She was writing about the mechanism, not in vague terms, but with specific details, specific locations, and a body count that she was accumulating through her own investigative work, while the official accounts described something far more limited. On the night of April 28, 2012, someone entered her home in Jalapa. The person likely entered through a window and surprised her in the bathroom. Martinez fought back. The attacker struck her jaw with what forensic examiners determined was a brass knuckle-type instrument, breaking it. Then a cloth was wrapped around her throat. She scratched at her attacker. DNA material was recovered from under her fingernails. It was never publicly matched to a charged suspect. She was found the following day. She had been strangled. The immediate investigation produced an arrest within days. A man whose connection to the case was framed by authorities as a personal dispute. That framing was disputed by her colleagues, her editors at Proceso, and by the international press freedom organizations that responded to the event. The explanation did not account for the nature of what she had been reporting, the known pattern of Veracruz journalists being targeted, or the documented history of the state's government operating alongside the organization she had been covering. Mexico was, during this period, consistently among the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Between 2017 and 2020, a journalist was taken approximately every week on average. Veracruz was one of the most concentrated sites of that violence. Reporters who covered the Zetas operations in the state, or who documented the activities of officials connected to those operations, were operating with the full understanding that the risk was structural rather than incidental. It was not a question of whether you might draw attention. It was a question of how much attention you had already drawn. Martinez had drawn a great deal of it. 8 years after her death, a coalition of 60 journalists from 25 media outlets across 18 countries, organized by a Paris-based nonprofit called Forbidden Stories, published a 5-part investigation called the Cartel Project. The project continued the reporting that Martinez had been doing at the time of her death and extended it using sources and documentation that had become available in the intervening years. What the project found, and what was subsequently confirmed by investigations in Mexico, the United States, and Spain, was that Governor Fidel Herrera Beltrán was under inquiry in all 3 countries on allegations that he had accepted funds from Zetas leadership during his campaign and had allowed the organization to operate freely during his administration. He had not been charged. He denied all allegations. At the time of the project publication, he had suffered a stroke and was in hospital. Javier Duarte, the governor who followed him, was convicted in Mexico of embezzlement and money laundering. He was sentenced to 9 years. His public security secretary, Arturo Bermúdez Zurita, was charged with running a dedicated elimination unit responsible for at least 15 confirmed disappearances. Bermúdez pleaded not guilty. His case was still pending at the time of the most recent available reporting. In 2017, investigators in Veracruz exhumed the remains of 250 people from sites across the state. In 2018, they found 168 more. Martinez had been reporting on the disappearances that produced those graves, while the people responsible were still in office. She had been naming the structure while it was still operational. The Cartel project described her work as the best available attempt at accountability and documentation in a state where both had been systematically suppressed. Her colleagues said that she had understood exactly what she was doing, understood the risk it carried, and kept going because she believed that the record needed to exist. She was one person, with a notepad and a phone, in a state where the governor's office and the most violent criminal organization in the region were working in coordination. She kept the record anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases covered so far have all involved people who either witnessed criminal operations directly or who documented them and paid the price. The next case involves something more complicated. 43 young men who may not have understood what they had stumbled into until it was already too late. What happened to them on the night of September 26, 2014, became the most scrutinized and least resolved case of enforced disappearance in the history of modern Mexico. Section 9. The 43. The Raúl Isidro Burgos Rural Teachers College sits in the town of Tixtla, in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero. It is a school with a long history of student activism. The young men who attend it come predominantly from poor rural families across Guerrero. They train to become teachers in the kind of remote, under-resourced communities that the Mexican state has historically struggled to serve. As part of that tradition, students at the college had for years organized political demonstrations, including an annual event to commemorate the Tlatelolco massacre of 1968, in which government forces fired on student protesters in Mexico City. Attending that commemoration required traveling to the capital, and the students had a long-established practice of commandeering passenger buses from local companies to make the journey, something that bus companies in the area largely tolerated. On September 26, 2014, approximately 100 students from the college set out toward the city of Iguala, about 120 kilometers away. They were traveling in buses, some taken from a local station, to raise funds and gather vehicles for the trip to Mexico City. They were unarmed students. Their ages ranged from roughly 18 to the mid-20s. None of them had any documented connection to any criminal organization. What happened in Iguala that night has been investigated by the Mexican government, by an independent international expert group, by forensic teams from Argentina, by journalists across multiple countries, and by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. 11 years later, the full truth of it remains officially unresolved. What is confirmed? Local police in Iguala, acting on instructions, set up roadblocks and intercepted the student buses. A confrontation followed across multiple locations in and around the city. 6 people lost their lives that night. 3 of them students from the college, along with a student from a different football team traveling on a separate bus that was also attacked, and 2 other individuals. One of the students found the following day was Julio Cesar Mondragon Fontes, 22 years old. The condition in which his body was found is part of the documented record of the night and indicated extreme, deliberate violence. 43 students were taken by individuals working alongside or within the local police structure and have not been seen since. The mayor of Iguala at the time, José Luis Abarca Velázquez, and his wife, María de los Ángeles Pineda Villa, fled the city after the events and were arrested in Mexico City in November 2014. Investigators identified Abarca as a probable organizer of the interception.
His wife had documented family connections to senior figures within the Guerreros Unidos criminal organization, which controlled Iguala and the surrounding territory. The Mexican government's official explanation, presented by then Attorney General Jesus Murillo Caram in November 2014, stated that the 43 students had been handed to Guerreros Unidos operatives, taken to a rubbish disposal site in the town of Cocula, eliminated, and incinerated. The government called this the historical truth. The independent expert group appointed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, known as the GIEI, formally rejected this account. The group, composed of internationally recognized forensic and legal specialists, concluded that the physical evidence at the Cocula site was inconsistent with the incineration of 43 bodies, and that the investigation had been conducted in a manner that obscured rather than established the facts. The GIEI's findings were published and are part of the documented record. The historical truth was not supported by the evidence gathered by independent specialists. What the DEA investigation added to the picture came from a separate case entirely. Beginning in 2013, the DEA's Chicago field office had been running a 15-month investigation into the Guerreros Unidos cartel's narcotics trafficking network in the American Midwest. The investigation confirmed that the organization was using passenger buses belonging to a company called Monarca, fitted with concealed compartments, to move heroin between Iguala and distribution cells in Aurora and Batavia, Illinois. The operation was moving in excess of 300 kilograms of heroin every month through those channels at its peak. The DEA arrested 5 cell leaders in Chicago in December 2014 and seized more than 68 kilograms of heroin, along with approximately $500,000 in cash. The Chicago investigation established that Iguala was the operational stronghold of Guerreros Unidos, and that the cartel's leadership was in direct contact with their American distribution network around the time the students disappeared. The DEA confirmed this through wiretapped communications. One of the Chicago cell leaders, Pablo Vega Cuevas, later testified that cartel members had been texting each other about what was happening in Iguala on the night of September 26th. The leading theory among independent investigators is that one of the buses the students commandeered that night contained a concealed heroin shipment belonging to Guerreros Unidos. That the cartel's local leadership, upon learning that students had taken a bus carrying their product, gave the instruction to intercept them, and that what followed was a response to the students having inadvertently placed themselves in possession of evidence of the organization's trafficking operation. That theory has not been officially confirmed. The families of the 43 have explicitly stated they do not accept any version of events that has not been verified through independent forensic investigation. As of 2025, 11 years after the night in Iguala, the remains of only 3 of the 43 students have been positively identified. Alexander Mora Venancio was confirmed in December 2014 through DNA comparison. Josivani Guerrero de la Cruz and Christian Alfonso Rodriguez Telumbre were identified in 2021. The other 40 remain unaccounted for. Jesus Murillo Caram, the former Attorney General who presented the discredited official account, was charged with enforced disappearance and is under house arrest. The special prosecutor assigned to the case stepped down in 2025. The investigation, by every available assessment, remains unresolved. 43 young men left for a protest and have not come home. Their parents have been searching for 11 years. The final case in this video is different from everything that has come before it. It does not involve a cartel attack on civilians, a massacre, or a disappearance. It involves a single building in Ciudad Juarez, a man with a set of keys, a code word for a gathering, and 12 people whose remains were dug out of a backyard, while the person responsible was on the payroll of the United States government the entire time. Section 10. The house on the quiet street. In a middle-class neighborhood in Ciudad Juarez, there was an ordinary-looking house with a metal gate. Nothing about it stood out. It sat on a residential street among other residential properties. Neighbors moved past it every day. Children played near it. On the outside, it looked exactly like what the neighborhood was. Modest, unremarkable, the kind of street that exists in every mid-sized Mexican city without distinction. Inside, over the course of approximately 8 months beginning in the autumn of 2003, at least 12 people were taken there and did not leave. The man who held the keys to that house was working for the United States government. His name in the court documents and investigative records is Lalo. He was a confidential informant operating under the control of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, based out of an office in El Paso, Texas. ICE had recruited him as part of an operation targeting a senior figure in the Juarez cartel known as the Engineer, a man named Heriberto Santillan Tabares, described by the agency as the number 3 figure in the organization at the time. Lalo had legitimate access to Santillan's operation. He was trusted, and he was simultaneously filing reports with his ICE handlers about what he was doing and seeing inside it. What he was doing and seeing was this. When cartel leadership wanted someone removed, they used a specific phrase when contacting Lalo. "We are going to have a barbecue." That phrase was Lalo's instruction to go to the house, unlock it, and prepare it for what was coming. He would stop at a local hardware store on the way. He purchased duct tape and quicklime, items for restraining people and for managing what remained of them afterward. Then he would wait. The victims, people identified by the cartel leadership as threats, liabilities, or rivals, were brought to the property. What happened inside followed a consistent pattern. People were restrained. They were subjected to prolonged violence. Then they were taken into the small backyard, where they were buried. Lalo was present during these events. He was not a passive observer. In his own admissions to Mexican authorities, documented in records later obtained by NPR, he stated that during the first event he witnessed and participated in, he held the victim's legs while the person was strangled, suffocated, and struck repeatedly with a shovel. He secretly recorded audio of that first event and turned it over to his ICE handlers. ICE knew. The murders continued for 8 months. Lalo's position with the agency had not been without complications before the house became operational. At a Border Patrol checkpoint, he had been caught smuggling more than 100 pounds of a controlled substance, packed into the wheels of his pickup truck. The Drug Enforcement Administration reviewed the case and formally removed him from any cooperation program. ICE reviewed the same case and kept him on the payroll. Federal prosecutors working with ICE had the charges against him dropped. The DEA's decision and ICE's decision went in opposite directions. ICE's asset continued working. The house continued operating. By the time Mexican authorities were eventually directed to the property and began excavating the backyard, they recovered 12 sets of human remains. The victims were extracted over several nights. A woman named Lorenza Magaña, who worked with families of those subjected to violence in Juarez, stayed outside the house across multiple nights watching the process. She described the smell that came up from the ground each time a new set of remains was brought out. She said that relatives of people who had gone missing stood vigil alongside her, watching to see if someone they were looking for would emerge from the dirt. Most of the 12 people buried in that backyard
have never been fully identified in the public record. They are known to have been brought there because they were perceived as threats to the operation Lalo was embedded in. Rivals, people who had seen or heard something that made them a problem. Individuals whose continued existence was considered a liability by the leadership he was reporting to. The same leadership he was being paid by an American
federal agency to help bring down. When the case became public through NPR's reporting in 2010, years after the events, it produced significant scrutiny of how ICE had managed the informant relationship. The core question was straightforward. At what point did the agency know that the person it was running as an asset was not simply gathering intelligence, but was actively involved in the removal of human beings? The audio recording of the first event had been handed over while it was still happening. The reports continued through 8 months of further events. No ICE official was charged in connection with the case. Lalo was eventually relocated. His whereabouts were not made public. The house on the quiet street in Juarez has no official memorial. The neighbors who lived alongside it for those 8 months, who heard whatever they heard and saw whatever they saw, said nothing publicly. In Ciudad Juarez in 2003 and 2004, saying nothing was the only rational response available to an ordinary person on an ordinary street who happened to live near something that was not ordinary at all. That is, in the end, what connects every single case in this video. Not the scale, not the cartel involved, not the specific location or the specific year. The connecting thread is simpler and harder than any of those details. Knowing something, or being in a position where someone believes you might know something, was enough. In every case covered here, that was the only qualification required. What that tells us about the world these organizations built, and about the cost of silence versus the cost of speaking, is worth sitting with after everything you have just heard. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.